The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of Georgia Southern University, the Department of History, the Fashion Merchandising and Apparel Design Program, or any other faculty or staff. Welcome to Unraveling the Seams, History, Economics, and Social Justice in the Garment Industry, a collaboration between the Department of History and the Fashion Merchandising and Apparel Design Program at Georgia Southern University. I'm Addie Martindale, your moderator for the evening. Tonight, we have a dynamic panel for you featuring Georgetown University's Professor Pietro Rivoli, Georgia Southern's Dr. Michelle Haberland, and sustainable fashion consultant Rebecca Blake Thompson. Each panelist will talk for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will take questions from the comments on the Georgia Southern Department of History's YouTube channel. As a reminder for students attending, an attendance verification word will be given towards the end of the event. Now, without further delay, let's meet our first panelist. Michelle Haberland. Michelle Haberland is a professor of history here at Georgia Southern. She received her PhD from Tulane University, where she began working on striking beauties, women apparel workers in the United States South, 1930 through 2000. The first book-length study of the Southern apparel industry and its workers. Published in 2015, by the University of Georgia Press, Striking Beauties was awarded the H.L. Mitchell Award by the Southern Historical Association for the best book published concerning the history of the Southern working class. At Georgia Southern, Michelle directed the Women's and Gender Studies program from 2012 through 2015. Since 2015, Michelle has served on the Women, Genders, and Sexuality Studies Executive Board. In the History Department, Michelle leads courses on a variety of subjects, including working class history, the United States in the 1960s, the New South, and oral history. She also served as the executive secretary for the Southern Association for Women Historians and represented faculty at public universities on the executive council for the Georgia Conference of the American Association of University Professors. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be doing this. I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen and get that started. Just bear with me for 1 second while we do that. Not what I expected to happen. Let me try that one more time. There we go. I knew I could do it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the history. Okay, why does that keep happening? Sorry about that. There we go. I'm going to talk about the history of the apparel industry. And I'm going to basically look at the period between the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh. So I think it's really important to understand that as far back as the colonial period, women sewed and spun cloth for their families. Some contributed significantly to household earnings by selling the products of their domestic labor. It's not surprising then that the apparel industry that developed in the centuries that followed would seek to hire women workers. Sewing and spinning were essentially domestic crafts that evolved into women's outside work. Throughout the 19th century, whether rich or poor, most women knew how to sew. All of the needle crafts, including basic sewing and embroidery, were considered essential skills for young women to master. But by the turn of the 20th century, the sewing machine was becoming commonplace. In major cities across the country, but especially in New York City, ready-made ready-made clothing, like what we buy today, became a hallmark of newly opened department stores. So no longer people were wearing clothes sewn by their mother or their wives. Now they were wearing clothes sewed by women in factories or in sweatshops. Clothing production moved from the home to the sweatshop and eventually to the factory, but throughout its transformations there, it remained tremendously dependent upon women's labor. With its traditional long-standing preference for women workers, the apparel industry has always been among the most feminine of industries. Unlike many industries, the apparel industry developed with decentralized production, such as subject as the industry was to the variances of fashion and seasonal demand. The production of one particular garment or style often occurred in many places, with different aspects of production contracted out to the least expensive shops. Apparel firms would design the garment and then sign contracts with different subcontractors to assemble and sew the garments. These independent subcontractors competed fiercely with one another as they were dependent on the firms they contracted with for their very survival. The pressure for production at lowest costs led to terrible working conditions in these subcontractors' shops, or as they were known more aptly, sweatshops. The complicated decentralized structure of clothing production has largely endured to this day, even in the face of globalization. So there were these two fellows from Russia, Max Planck and Isaac Harris, and they became known as the Shirtwaist Kings. They set up the Triangle Factory in New York City to make triangle shirtwaists. And you can see here in the top right corner what a shirtwaist looked like. It was a high-necked blouse, typically made of light cotton or even sheer fabric, and then tucked in. That was the big innovation, that it would be tucked in. There's a little belt at the bottom of each of the shirtwaists. So Blank and Harris were notorious for opposing labor unions. They opposed labor unions because they saw them as a threat to their control of the means of production, but also they saw it as a sort of personal affront that somebody would be trying to take away their profits, basically. And so because they opposed unions, they very often hired immigrant women workers, and that was easy to do in New York City, which was a mecca of immigrants at the turn of the 20th century. So immigrant women workers would have no family ties or little family ties, right, to rely on. They wouldn't have a large network, and that made them, well, frankly, perfectly exploitable. So as the sweatshops multiply and these subcontractors continue to compete, worker opposition to these oppressive working conditions leads to unionization. So in 1909, the ILG has a meeting in the Lower East Side of New York City. And this meeting is well publicized. And Harris and Blank and others promised to fire any workers who attend that meeting. And so after the meeting, indeed, more than 100 workers who attended that meeting were fired. Clara Lemlich organized another meeting shortly after that. And as she listened to various people talk, she decided she would take the stage. And as she made her way to the stage, she shouted in Yiddish, "I want to say a few words." She said, "I have no further patience for talk, as I am one of those who feels and suffers the things that have been pictured here. I move that we go on a general strike now," end quote. The audience rose to their feet, cheered, and a vote was taken, and the strike was on. So it was called the Uprising of 20,000. It was one of the largest strikes America had ever seen in its history. And the strike goes on for basically a year. The workers were demanding a 20% pay raise, a 52-hour, note what I'm saying here, a 52-hour work week. The 40-hour work week is a long way off still. And extra pay for overtime, which they never got, and recognition of their union. In February of 1910, the strike was finally settled, and most of the factories rehired strikers and agreed to higher wages and shorter hours. But that did not happen at the Triangle factory. Workers at the Triangle factory went back to the work without a union agreement. Management never addressed their specific demands, which had included unlocking the doors in the factory and ensuring that the fire escapes functioned. So 2 years later, in 1911, a fire broke out in the afternoon of March 25th. It was a savage fire that broke out on the 8th floor. It was probably started by someone tossing a cigarette into a bin with scrap fabric. Women did not smoke commonly in that era, so it was probably one of the men who were a cutter or a machinist. So the fire rages, the workers are locked in. The first thing they discover is that the fire hose the fire hose that comes first is non-functional, and panic really ensues. The executives on the 10th floor did manage to escape. That's where the executive office were, on the top floor of the building. They did manage to escape. They had access to fire escapes, and then they were able to go to the roof of their building and then scramble to another building, another roof nearby. So Harris and Blank escaped the fire. And they're actually kind of made themselves out to be heroes for that, which was really quite curious when you see what happened. Eventually, the fire department, such as it was, the fire crews come, and they have hoses that reach the 7th floor and ladders that only reach the 6th floor. So on the 8th floor, the workers remained trapped. With the doors and stairwells and exits locked, workers faced truly grim choices. Of the 200 workers on the 8th floor, 146 perished. Many jumped to their deaths, as you can see here, jumped to their deaths on the pavement below. Now, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire has enormous consequences for the garment industry. First, due to rising pressure from both the union and from the public in New York City, who had just witnessed the greatest industrial tragedy in the state's history, due to that pressure, Harris and Blank were indicted on 7 counts of manslaughter. But the efforts to hold them accountable were utterly fruitless. At the trial, they heard testimony from no less than 100 witnesses. And still, the judge ruled that Harris and Blank were not responsible in any way for the deaths. They could not even at the time, and again, they boasted about this, they could not even at the time identify the women, mostly women, who had been working on the 8th floor because they were hired by subcontractors. So therefore, they said they weren't their actual employees. Another consequence of or maybe the lasting consequence, because that really wasn't much of a consequence, was it, with Harris and Blank acquitted. Another really important consequence was that the state of New York and the nation as a whole, but especially the state of New York, instituted a lot of labor reforms and inspections of working conditions, and also they demanded increased unionization. And that you would see happen, that more and more people would flock to the union in the aftermath of the Triangle Factory fire, because garment workers realized that the union was probably what was going to be the best protection they could get. But that protection from the union led to higher wages and better working conditions, and that cost apparel employers money and profits. And so they moved to the South. They began to move to the South. I just want to talk us through this chart real quickly. And you'll see in the early years of the apparel industry, it is mostly centered in the Midwest and mostly in the Northeast. But as the decades move on, almost half at some points in the 1980s, almost half of American apparel workers, American garment workers, worked in the United States South. So when we talk about the movement of industries and people, we always like to talk about push factors and pull factors, right? So the push factors for the garment industry moving from the Northeast to the South are basically avoiding labor unions and higher labor costs. But let me talk about that. The industry first moves not very far south from its center in New York City. It moves to places like Reading, Pennsylvania, and Baltimore, New York, where new factories are set up. But the unions move rapidly with them. And so the companies, the apparel companies, will again seek to move south further south in the US, because they want to avoid these higher wages and higher and improved working conditions required by labor union contracts. There are also always pull factors, right? It's not just push, it's also pull. And the pull factors are really coming from United States or towns and cities in the United States South. So sewing factories built brand new companies and factories exactly to the specifications of these northern employers. So they would reach out to northern employers and say, hey, you want to move to my community? I can get you a factory. And they would raise the money to build that factory to the company specifications by raising a bond issue within the community. So local folks would basically put into a fund to build a factory that would bring jobs to their community. Southern communities also made lots of promises of their workforces of being quite abundant, docile, and very anti-union. That wasn't a quiet whisper. It was an outright statement in many of the letters that Southern civic leaders wrote to Northern employers. So as the industry moves to places like Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, it adapts very quickly to this Southern notion that factory work was a privilege of whiteness, that factory work was something that would address or be reserved primarily for white workers. So this photo here that you see is on the slide is from Winder, Georgia in 1955. And you can see that they are sewing their apparel, it looks like chinos and khakis and their pockets hanging out and so on. And they are all women in this sewing machine, or in this sewing factory in Winder, Georgia. Now, I did most of my interviews, or the majority of my interviews, with folks who worked in Vanity Fair in various states. So Vanity Fair, for those women in the audience, you're probably listening to this, and I know Vanity Fair, but I think some of the men might not. So Vanity Fair is a lingerie manufacturer primarily, so bras, slips, panties, but they also made jeans. They did Lee jeans for a little while. So they did some other clothes as well. So this photograph is a company photo of Clark Mills, which is a Vanity Fair factory in Jackson, Alabama, not Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson, Alabama. And it was taken in 1955. I might add, a year after the famous Board versus Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court case, which ordered the desegregation of public schools. So I want to talk about occupational segregation by race and by gender. And And I'm going to blow this picture up a little bit on the next slide so you can get a closer look. So when I interviewed Vanity Fair workers, they very frequently told me that no Blacks worked in the factory prior to 1965. And as you can see, this factory photo here is clearly sort of delineated by occupation. The women in the middle, where I'm moving my mouse, and I hope you can see it, the women in the middle there, those are the sewing machine operators. The men up front, these would have been the plant managers, the supervisors. And then in the back row, you'll see 2 rows of white men. And those white men would have been the machinists, the cutters. And so, as you can see, this is an industry that is segregated by both race and gender. Clark County was 50-50 Black and white, and yet this photograph is almost exclusively white. I say almost because despite the fact that many of the women who worked at Vanity Fair told me in their interviews that no men worked there, you'll see there are a few Black men here in the very, very back, and they would have worked as janitors. And there were only a few of them in your typical Southern sewing plant. So I think it's really important to note 2 things, that we have racial and occupational segregation by both race and gender. And it's demonstrated, I think, really clearly in this photo. Clark County was 50-50 Black-white, and it was 50-50 male-female, but that's not what we're seeing in this photograph. So increasingly, well, beginning with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and the establishment of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, we see efforts to desegregate the Southern apparel industry succeed. And interracial union organizing also is successful in the 1960s and early 1970s. I have to tell you, this is my absolute favorite photo from my book. Elizabeth Boykin, pictured here, she was the one who brought the ILG to Vanity Fair's Clark Mills factory. And this is their organizing committee. They always made a point of, when they traveled, and they had to travel for union meetings and such, they always made a point of traveling and staying in hotel rooms, 1 Black woman and 1 white woman sharing a hotel room. That was really important to them. But the successes would be short-lived in the United States South, because beginning sort of in the 1960s, but especially in the 1970s, we start to see trade barriers, protective trade practices removed. And the apparel industry will head south again. And we'll talk about that. But Nick Bonanno, he was the regional director of the Southeast ILG office. And he said once to me in an interview I thought was really important. He pointed out that historically speaking, the apparel industry has always sought the lowest level. So from the 1930s to the 1970s, the lowest level available to American apparel factories was the United States South. But when trade barriers were removed, or began to be removed, you start to see a big change in that. You start to see the low wage, labor intensive structure of the clothing industry, coupled with these decreasing trade barriers that really make relocation to the global South almost effortless. So in the 1980s, the Southern communities that had once welcomed apparel factories and the promises of jobs and economic salvation, they began to notice a change. Apparel factories all across the United States South closed their doors forever, leaving more and more women stitchers unemployed. Meanwhile, communities in Mexico and other global South countries welcomed the garment industry and looked forward to the fulfillment of those same promises of jobs and wages and economic salvation that had once brightened the future of the United States South. In the global apparel industry, more a little more or less, I should say, it continued as it moved south to the global south, its long-standing tradition on the reliance on female labor, just as it had done when it moved from the north to the south in the United States, beginning in the 1930s. In the last decade, the global apparel industry has suffered several horrific tragedies that remind us of the industry's long history. In September 2012, a fire blazed through a Karachi, Pakistan garment factory. Dozens of young women jumped from the factory windows, just as young immigrant women workers did a century earlier in the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City. In this factory fire, 300 workers, 300 Pakistani, mostly women, lost their lives in that 2012 factory fire. The human cost of globalization of the apparel industry became all too clear on April 24th, 2013. On that day, an 8-story building that held several apparel factories in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, just outside of Dhaka, collapsed. And it killing more than 1,000 workers, again, mostly young women. In the week after the collapse, as the death toll became apparent and rescue efforts moved into recovery strategies, workers and consumers around the world were outraged. When cracks had appeared in the buildings and beams weeks earlier, an inspection had been ordered. But despite the building inspector's conclusion that the workers should be kept away from the building, the factory owners had compelled their workers to return to their sewing machines. It is in this moment, as we struggle to account for the human cost behind the clothes we wear, that the history of the clothing industry seems more relevant than ever. Taslima Akhtar, a Bangladeshi photographer and activist, captured this achingly beautiful and sad photograph of 2 workers, a man and a woman, engaged in a last embrace as the building's 8 floors collapsed. The 2 figures are entombed by debris, fabric, concrete, and rebar. The man's face is clear, with red blood coming from his eyes like tears. The woman's arm bears a modest gold bangle, her arm stretched out only to fall just short of the man's neck. Akhtar says the photo, quote, haunts me. It's as if they're saying to me, we are not a number, not only cheap labor and cheap lives. We are human beings like you. Our life is precious like yours, and our dreams are precious too, end quote. Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity.
Thanks, Michelle. That was very informative. Next, we will hear from Dr. Pietro Rivoli. Professor Rivoli teaches finance and international business in the undergraduate, graduate, and executive programs at Georgetown University. She has special interest in social justice issues, in international business, and in China, and regularly leads MBA residencies to China. Her academic research has been published in numerous leading journals, including the Journal of International Business, Business Ethics Quarterly, the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking. In 2006, Professor Rivoli was awarded the Faculty Pioneer Award by the Aspen Institute. Professor Rivoli's book, The Travel of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy, has been widely acclaimed by both the popular press and the academic community as a path-breaking study of globalization that has received numerous awards. These honors include being named one of the best business books of the year by the Financial Times, Booz Allen Hamilton, Foreign Affairs, the Library Journal, and Amazon.com. And her book has been translated into 14 languages. And now I'll hand it over to Dr. Rivoli.
Thank you so much, Addie, and thank you, Michelle, as well. So thank you all for inviting me to this Georgia Southern event, and thank you very much for your interest in this really important topic. I'll just talk very briefly about my book, as Michelle asked me to do, and then offer a couple of current perspectives I think that will follow and relate pretty closely to the remarks that Michelle made. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. So my book is called The Travels of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy, and it's based on a very simple idea. I am a professor of international business and trade. And I was motivated to see if I could study these topics through the lens of a very simple product. So what I decided to do was buy a T-shirt. I bought the T-shirt on vacation down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida one day. And then I proceeded to do kind of amateur detective work to see if I could stitch together, if you will, the life story of this simple object. So that detective work led me to discover that my T-shirt did indeed have a very global life. And it touched many continents and many different industries and many different types of workers in our global labor force. So some of you may know that the United States is the world's largest exporter of raw cotton. And it maybe is no surprise to you that much of the clothing that we wear, has as its primary raw ingredient cotton grown in the United States. Now, the United States is the biggest exporter of raw cotton, but within the United States, West Texas is the most important cotton producing region. So the birthplace of the T-shirt I studied was West Texas, was the cotton country of West Texas. And that is the center of a fascinating industry in the United States. You think of cotton as one of the so-called big ag crops. The United States just excels at this industrial production of things like cotton and soy and wheat. Now that cotton was shipped in bales all the way to China, and in China, a number of things happened to it. A number of production processes took place. The cotton was spun into yarn and then knit into fabric, and then ultimately it was stitched in a garment factory of the type that Michelle was talking about into a T-shirt. Okay. The T-shirt then comes back to the United States, where I purchased it. And ultimately in the United States, T-shirts and other clothing have a life beyond the purchase in the US. And that's because in the US, we end up donating so much of the clothing that we buy. So a lot of our clothing ends up in Goodwill or in Salvation Army drop-off bins. We donate way more clothing than there is use for in the United States. And so there's a whole nother global industry that has emerged to sort and class and market this clothing and give it another life in other markets. A big market for used clothing is in the East African country of Tanzania. And so the final part of my research was in Tanzania, investigating kind of that chapter of the T-shirt's life. So writing the book was a grand adventure. I had a lot of fun, not just because I got to learn about the industries and the business and the politics, but primarily because I got to know the people who were engaged at each stage of the T-shirt's life. So, I love this slide here because it shows a beautiful rainbow of our humanity on this earth. We have Nelson and Ruth Reinsch, who helped me study cotton in West Texas. We have below them Hiwan Ji, who is a garment worker in Shanghai. Jeffrey Malongi in Tanzania is there with his shop where he sells used T-shirts from the United States. And then also an important group of guys, and yes, they are all guys, but they're from, 6 different countries. This is a meeting of trade policy negotiators. And as Michelle talked about, changes in trade policy were a very important factor that caused the shift in location of this industry. And these rules kind of get hammered out in Washington by people involved in our political system. So these are all kind of characters in the story. And, I was just very, very honored to be able to tell their story. Now, one of the things that was clear, I think, from Michelle's remarks is that labor history, labor rights, these have long been associated with the textile and apparel industry, going back even earlier than the sweatshop period in the United States. The very first factories in the world were textile factories in Great Britain. And really, that's where the first kind of factory labor activism took place. There were early protests, for example, to ban child labor. There were many protests about unsafe working conditions. When you move to China's communist revolution, historians now trace, the initial kind of agitation that led to the communist revolution to textile workers outside of the city of Shanghai. And then, of course, as Michelle noted, the labor activism in the northern garment industry, sparked by things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, were definitive moments in labor history in the United States. Now, more recently, where we see the concern about labor conditions and sweatshops and so forth, as Michelle mentioned, is in the global South. It is important to recognize that there are many, many, many different jobs associated with the production of apparel. There are, and you know this because I know you have departments at Georgia Southern where you can study these things. But if you think about the jobs that are required to produce an article of clothing, there are articles in design, in marketing, in supply chain management, and so forth. It's actually a very small part of the labor force that is engaged in actually stitching our clothing together. Most of the work that goes into the apparel industry actually still takes place in the United States in high skilled positions in things like design and marketing. Now, why did this industry kind of move? Well, as Michelle talked about, we tend to think of the movement of the sewing stage of the apparel production process as being driven by chasing kind of lower and lower cost labor. Now, the reason that this is important in this industry is because garment production historically has been a very labor intensive process. Okay? So this next slide shows you 2 different production processes today. On the left is a Tesla factory. If you look very, very, very carefully, you can see a human being back here. But Teslas are primarily produced by robots. It's a capital and technology intensive process with very few human beings involved. If you contrast that with the picture on the right of an apparel factory in Guangzhou, you see a very labor-intensive production process. Okay? So it makes sense that if your production process for apparel or anything else, relies on people rather than technology, then you will have this kind of force of what we have come to call the race to the bottom, where production moves to lower and lower and lower cost locations. And when we say lower cost, because we're talking about a labor intensive production process, really we're talking about a race to the bottom in wages. And so this is a long historical pattern that this production kind of moves from place to place. Now, you wouldn't find the Tesla factories moving from place to place, chasing cheaper labor. And that's because, again, there's just very little labor in the production process. Okay? The point that I'd like to make, and it's a very important one, and it's also, I think, a relatively recent development, is that the world in every industry is moving to look more and more like the picture on the left. No matter what you're producing, whether it's loaves of bread or cars or sweatshirts, okay, technology and automation is on a kind of unstoppable march. And that means we're going to be producing more and more of everything with fewer and fewer people. Now, the long-term trend in the United States for manufacturing in general kind of suggests the truth of what I just said. In the red, you see manufacturing output in the United States. In other words, just the amount of stuff our economy is producing. And it's been going up, pretty steadily. It dips during recessions, but it's been going up since the end of the war. The United States is producing higher and higher levels of output. But on the right, either in raw numbers or in percentage terms, you see the number of workers engaged in manufacturing. And that has been falling almost as fast as output has been rising. So on the left, you see the number of workers in manufacturing. On the right, you see the percentage of workers, which is now at about 8%. Okay? So we're producing more and more with fewer and fewer people. In other words, as I said, the world is looking more and more like a Tesla factory. Now, a critical point about the garment industry is, since I have been doing research on this, the party line from everyone, no matter whether you were talking to the unions or the companies or the politicians, is that garment production can't really be automated because you need a human being sitting at a sewing machine sewing seams together. And as long as you need that human being, then labor costs are going to drive location decisions. Okay? Now, I noticed, I think it was Addie. In Addie's background there, you saw a sewing machine. Okay? I'm going to suggest to you that in a very short period of time, that sewing machine is going to be kind of like a typewriter. You will recognize it, you'll understand why it existed, but it won't be something that people use anymore. Okay? Now, this is, again, something that is happening very quickly. Okay? We now, if I went to study T-shirts today, we now have a hands-free T-shirt production process. In other words, a robot that can make a T-shirt. No people, no sewing machines. Now, this technology and this automation is happening very, very quickly. Nobody thought it would happen in this industry. It is happening. It's happening in Georgia. It's happening in Arkansas. It's happening in Alabama. It's happening all over the country. And if you can have robots making T-shirts, then there is no longer a reason for that production to chase lower cost labor in places like Bangladesh. Okay. Now, this means, I think, that people concerned about labor issues, about labor rights, about the well-being of lower skilled women workers around the world need to change their focus a little bit. Okay? And they need to recognize that the most important thing we can do for women in today's global labor force is make sure they are prepared to work in those higher skilled jobs in this industry or in other industries, right? If we stay focused, okay, on solving a problem, okay, that kind of assumes an old production process, then we are not going to be serving the real interest of these women in the future. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very illuminating. Now we'll move on to our last presenter. Rebecca Blake Thompson is an activist for garment worker rights in the fashion industry. After working for luxury fashion for over a decade for designers like DVF, Jason Wu, and Michael Kors, Rebecca shifted her focus to advocating for people and the planet over profit. As a senior editorial writer and education contributor for Remake, she hosted community organizing calls to lead the global ambassador team towards collective action in support of the international #PayUp campaign and in lobbying for California state legislation SB 62 in partnership with the Garment Workers Center. In her current role as Director of Development at Sui Sew Shop in Los Angeles, Rebecca is working with a team to build programs that make reuse accessible to all and encourage community action in support of garment workers. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. It's always so awkward to hear your own bio read. I appreciate that. Let me present my screen to you guys. So one thing that's going to be really important is remembering the context of, what both Michelle and Pietro had first shared, because it brings it into the present tense, which is what I'm going to talk about, which is the conditions here in Los Angeles for garment workers. But a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about can be, applied at scale to global garment worker conditions, as we'll see, because we discussed, the history of the industry and how, unfortunately, a lot of these trends keep repeating themselves. So, it's interesting because I think one of the greatest lies or deceptions that consumers are still buying is the belief that made in the USA ensures, quality production, fair wages, it supports local businesses, and it's better for the environment. But the reality is that some of the greatest social and environmental abuses in the fashion industry are happening right here at home. I mean, I am personally in Los Angeles, but right here, domestically in the United States. And they're being perpetrated by a lot of brands, that consumers love and trust. Los Angeles is the garment production capital of the United States, with an estimated anywhere between 45,000 and 60,000 garment workers. There's a reason we don't know the exact number, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. But these garment workers are suffering from what, we might call, in more layman's terms, third world conditions, things like that, things that we wouldn't expect would be happening here in the United States. So we're going to go through that. So one thing that's critical to understand in terms of how the apparel industry works, and again, Michelle, referenced this in her talk, was kind of how this subcontracting works. And so I wanted to put this visual up here for you because I think a lot of people don't quite understand how these injustices could still be happening in 2021, could still be happening in the United States, because they don't quite understand the structure of the garment industry. And this, this was done by Sweatshop Watch, over 15 years ago, but the model still stands. And the model is not, it doesn't just apply to Los Angeles or domestic production, it applies to global production in general, how it works. So I'm going to walk you guys through that kind of what it looks like. So at the top here, we have the retailers and the brands, right? So let's give an example of, just a generic retailer who might be, perpetrating some of the abuses. And I'm going to get very specific too in this model. I'm going to get specific based on some of the research and the journalism that I've done in this field. So it's important to understand how this structure works. We're going to start at the top and we're going to work our way down. So let's talk about Ross. Ross is somebody that when they talk about themselves, they talk about having a constant stream, extraordinary savings, huge bargains, off-price deals. They're so large, they have extreme purchasing power. They work directly with their manufacturers to negotiate the best deals, and they offer these deals almost every single day. Ross has, I think at the most recent take, they have around 2,500 stores in the United States, but their average item is only $10, right? It only costs $10, and 98% of the items in the store cost under $30. In the last fiscal year reported, they sold more than $14 billion in sales. They were second only to TJ Maxx in this kind of discount off-price category. And they have recorded 13 consecutive years of growth. So they're clearly creating product that is, in demand, is in high need, and is being heavily bought. So we're going to talk about also, I'm going to go into a little bit kind of working back through how the demand is created. Okay, so Ross we have is a publicly traded company. They are at the top of the structure. Oh, excuse me, my mouse just. So next we're going to move into what is a manufacturer, okay? So a manufacturer would be somebody like LA Fashion Source, is just a random example. There's thousands of these here in Los Angeles. They specialize in sourcing materials and doing pattern making, apparel manufacturing, finishing services. They'll work directly with brands to kind of help, with those, outsourced needs for the brand. But there's a lot of brands here in Los Angeles. I think they're just going to keep popping up. There's tons of examples of who these manufacturers are. They're all over the place. They're very easy to find. So we have them. They're a privately owned manufacturer. And what's critical to understand is the next step in the process, right? Where it goes after this. It's estimated that there's about 5,000 manufacturers here in Los Angeles, and they want to be very visible. They want to be easily contacted. They highly advertise themselves. They bid for jobs from retailers and brands. But on the flip side, they're very opaque about disclosing who their particular contractors are, which we'll talk about in the next step, and subcontractors and who they work with. Due to private ownership of most of these manufacturers, they're responsible only by the bid or the job contract to the retailers that hire them, and to their direct employees. So they often subcontract very large volume jobs, and through this method also limit their legal liability to the workers who we'll get to at the bottom, who ultimately complete the work in this chain. Okay, so next it's important to talk about the subcontracting. And this is where the work in the apparel industry is really being done. This is where the volume of work is being done. These subcontractors are who employ, the garment workers, doing various jobs, in cutting, sewing, finishing, trimming, all kinds of dyeing, all kinds of processes that need to happen. One thing that people need to understand, and this will reference back to, what Michelle was discussing, is within the estimated 45,000 to 60,000 garment workers here in Los Angeles, the majority of them are undocumented immigrants, still predominantly women. The reason that we don't know the exact number is because of the workers' undocumented status. And it is exactly that undocumented status that, as it did 150 years ago, still forces a culture of coercion and abuse and manipulation to the workers through the threat of all kinds of things, especially in the recent political climate of the last several years. Workers will threaten undocumented immigrants with calling ICE, with deportation. And a lot of these workers, as they did, a long time ago, still feel completely powerless. There is, of course, the cultural, fear that's very prevalent for immigrants in this country right now. But there's also just the threat of not receiving that next paycheck, because a lot of these workers are not, legally here in the country and don't have legal status. They fear that they have no legal repercussions. And so a lot of people would say, yes, but, how is this possible? Or, how are they getting away with this? It's hard to understand that, the majority of these subcontracting networks are very illegal operations, and the capacity of government, things like the Bureau of Field Enforcement, who is responsible for investigating the enforcement of labor standards and, covering workmen's comp insurance, or the Labor Employment Tax Force, they don't really have enough resources to be able to go and check in on all of these subcontracting factories. And the other nature of these subcontracting factories is that, because, Pietro showed us the Tesla factory, where that machinery is highly advanced. It's very difficult to move. Once you make the investment in setting up a factory like that, it's not something that would make financial sense to move around very often. But the way that these factories work, as you can see here in this image, is the equipment that's required for these garment workers to do their job is often just a table, a simple folding chair, and a sewing machine. So that's either a cover stitch, an overlock machine, or a single needle machine. For cutting, they'll have a mobile cutter. They need a flat surface. They might need something to press and roll out the fabric. But largely the machinery is very mobile and easy to move. So one thing that's actually very prevalent here in Los Angeles, here today, right now, is that what a lot of these subcontractors will do is they will open up a factory. They will, recruit employees for a specific amount of time. And what will happen is that the workers will then go back to work on Monday and the factory is gone. And that sounds like crazy and weird, but in my work with the Garment Workers Center, we hear this all the time. This is actually quite common. And, there's several reasons for that. One, it allows these factories to escape liability. If they feel like, there might be the threat of, legal attention or something like that, they can close and move very quickly. But another thing that happens is they don't pay workers for weeks at a time. And when they move abruptly like this, the workers who have all of that back pay that's owed to them can't find it, can't get it, and the contractor gets away with, not having to pay that. And I don't only mean to paint the contractors out as bad guys, because again, we're going to go through when we look at the pyramid structure again and talk about the enormous pressure that they're under to make these things happen. So it's really important to understand, why the culture and the makeup of garment worker workforce has a very big implication on the conditions and the treatment that these garment workers receive here. And so, yes, well, here's some, stats that are just kind of helpful to understand. 71% of garment workers are immigrants. It's estimated mostly Latin American and Asian, according to the California Bureau of Labor Statistics. Human trafficking, specifically here in Los Angeles, because we are both an ocean, a port by ocean, and a border crossing by land, actually represents a huge point of entry for human trafficking as well. Human trafficking in the garment industry here in Los Angeles is also very prevalent, and of course something that we can't see exact numbers on because of the nature of it. There have been laws here in the United States over the past 20 years, starting with I don't have enough time, but there was an incident in 1995 with a Thai worker factory where dozens and dozens of workers were found locked in, again, similar to the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, were found locked in a home under horrific conditions, basically, indentured servitude, and human trafficking. And after that happened, there were various laws that passed in 1999. I think that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed in 2000 because of what was legislation that was brought forward in 1999. And then you can see here in 2002, SB 1818 ensured that all California labor laws applied to workers irrespective of immigration status. So there has been steps. But of course, as you can imagine, for the majority of these workers of undocumented status, they don't, first of all, there's the barrier of information. They might not know that regardless of their immigration status, they're still protected under California labor law. Even if they do know that, there's often, the language barrier and things like that. But then, of course, there's just the threat and the fear of intimidation. Yes, the law says it will protect me, but as you can imagine, if you've ever had to work, through the courts for any issue, it can be a very lengthy, very drawn out process with huge repercussions, for your ability to keep working for that employer or to find other work and things like that. So it doesn't quite offer the protection that I think, on paper, it might look like. The greatest challenge, let me go ahead and redo that. The UCL Labor Center, estimates that between $26 million and $28 million is stolen via wage theft from workers every year. I think the most recent statistic we have, for 2021, for 2020, it's estimated that the average garment worker in Los Angeles made about $6.15 an hour. And the minimum wage here is $15 an hour. And so people always say, but how is that possible? It's because these subcontracting factories are illegal. It's because of a lot of the, quote, illegal immigration status of the workers so that they can't, receive the wages owed. So it's a huge issue. And the greatest challenge in this pyramid structure is that the garment retailers and the manufacturers at the top remain largely insulated from legal liability for the labor abuse that happens at the bottom of the pyramid. And the legal reach itself, it has always been limited in local courts due to the unfriendliness of, federal protections for undocumented workers. It's a huge challenge, and it's something that we're working on right now actively, with the Garment Workers Center to pass what is called SB 62. It's passed the Senate, it's going to the Assembly in the next few weeks. And SB 62 is so important because it seeks to move the liability further up the supply chain. Right now, Ross at the top of that pyramid could say, well, we only hired the manufacturer. We didn't hire the subcontractors, and we don't have oversight and control over who they hire and who they job it out to. And the goal with SB 62, this legislation that we're hoping to pass, is that it allows for more upward liability, so that the individual garment worker or a group of garment workers could prove, that they're sewing in labels, for Ross clothing or for specific brands, and there would be that upward liability. So there would have to be more due diligence on the parts of brands and manufacturers to really understand what's going on in their supply chain. One thing I want to mention quickly, and I'm sorry I'm talking so fast, it's hard to fit in, and I want you guys to know so much and understand all this. One thing that's, also important to understand with the pyramid structure is, as we discussed, many items at Ross, and 98% of their items are under $30, and many items are $10. Well, if you understand that the legal minimum wage here in Los Angeles is $15 an hour, but the item only costs $10, you have to look back, and I love that Pietro kind of talked about this a little bit, because if you think into the entire supply chain of the average T-shirt, there was, the cotton farmer that grew it. There was the agricultural worker, that picked the cotton. Then the cotton needs to be sent to be spun. Then it's going to be, after it's spun into yarn, then that yarn has to be milled into cloth, and then that cloth has to be dyed or printed. And then somebody has to cut that, and then somebody has to sew that. And then after it's sewn, it's going to be, shipped around the world, and it's going to end up in a retail store where they have to pay the rent and the lights and the electricity and the salespeople and the signage. So for something to get that far and only cost $10, understanding that at least 25 hands, have touched that t-shirt throughout the process, you can imagine that it is completely impossible that every person along that supply chain that touched that garment would be paid, their fair. Legal wages aren't always fair. That's a whole nother discussion, but, would be justly compensated for the work that they're doing. And so Ross starts at the top and says, well, this manufacturer said that they could get this shirt done in this amount of time by paying their worker legally with the materials we provided. But naturally, that manufacturer understands that the only way to get that done is to then job it out to a subcontractor who will accept a below minimum wage rate to have that labor done. And it trickles further and further down. Oftentimes, the turnaround that Ross wants on a 10,000 unit order, will be a matter of days. And again, the only way to produce that sheer volume is for the manufacturer to find multiple subcontractors who can handle that volume. So as you can see, the structure, creates a lot of challenges in the industry and really makes it hard for that upward accountability and for those garment workers to fight for their protections. And, I don't, this is some of the faces, some of the garment workers that we actually work with at the Garment Workers Center. And I don't want this to only be overwhelming. I want this to be more of what it was for me personally, at least what I can speak to. It was a call to action. It was really inspiring for me to understand what role I as a consumer played in, and how many more questions I could look and how much deeper I could go into the process. I love Pietro's curiosity to say, hey, like, where did this come from and what can that teach me? And the more that we understand about how something is made, by nature, we're going to have more empathy and more compassion. And if I can impart anything on you who are watching tonight, it's not to be overwhelmed or depressed by everything that we're telling you, but to be very curious, to be insanely curious, because a sense of curiosity is what we really need to dig deeper and to learn more and to start to understand how we in our own purchases and through our own action can become advocates for garment workers, how we can hold brands accountable, how we can talk to them about their labor practices and what's going on in their supply chain. And it's been truly shown that through, we saw through the Pay Up campaign that was mentioned in my bio, we raised over $40 billion in getting brands like Gap and JCPenney and H&M who had canceled orders due to the COVID pandemic. These orders were in various stages. They had either already ordered them to be done and then canceled them. The garments themselves maybe had been completed and finished, and the retailer said, oh, sorry, there's a global pandemic, act of God, we're not going to pay for this. Some of the stuff had already shipped across the country and they denied it and sent it back. The workers had already done the work and were already owed the wages, but the brands had the power because international law does not allow, for a brand to be held legally liable for placing a purchase order. What we saw with the Pay Up campaign is we, through a group of activists, put pressure through social media onto brands to say, hey, you have to pay for these orders. You need to pay these workers. And just the pressure of us as individuals and activists collectively raising our voices together through a movement resulted in those brands committing and following through with paying back, and I shouldn't say paying back because it was due, but paying for, due work to the tune of $40 billion. So there's great ways to get involved that you can do that. And so again, I just want to leave you with a sense of curiosity and asking questions. And I'm excited we're going to take some questions from the audience so we can learn more about what you guys are interested in. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Before we move into our questions, I want to let everyone know that the attendance verification word is pay up. Several of you will need that for your classes. Again, it's pay up. Okay. And at this time, I'd love for our panelists to all turn on their videos, and we will start fielding some questions. All right. So our first question we're going to take is, and I think this is going to be for you, Pietro. In the process of your research tracing the life of this cotton shirt, did you discover any differences between the lives of other types of clothing, specifically in the way of like fiber, so polyester or wool?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So polyester and synthetic fabrics, the production of those fabrics looks today everywhere in the world like the Tesla factory. So there are actually no hands that touch polyester or rayon or any of those synthetic fabrics. So, you know, it's a chemical process, it's petroleum based, and it's very capital intensive. So, you know, it doesn't start on a farm, right? Now, wool, on the other hand, you know, Australia and England are some of our biggest wool producers. These are wealthy countries, and wool production is also very automated and mechanized. Now, once you get to the clothing stage, the production process looks similar. Okay? If you're sewing a garment that's polyester, you know, that garment factory looks very similar to if you're sewing something that's made of cotton fabric. Now, knitting and weaving are slightly different processes, but I think if you're interested in the apparel stage, there are more similarities than differences across these fibers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This next question, I believe, will be aimed at Michelle. Okay. So what other labor unions were helpful or sympathetic to garment worker unions?
That is a good question. So really, there are several different garment unions. So you start off with the United Garment Workers, that folds more or less due to corruption. And then you move on to the era of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. That was for women's apparel. And then you had the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, which did men's apparel. And then eventually those unions merge and along with textile unions as well, into something called Unite Here. Unite Here is still around and quite active, and it sometimes goes by Here now. And you see they're organizing workers outside of the garment industry as well. In sort of the heyday of American labor in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you will see that most of the AFL-CIO unions would support garment workers in their strikes and their label campaigns and other things like that.
Fantastic. Rebecca, is there a way to improve the working conditions of the apparel industry without the price of garments increasing significantly?
Oh man, I'm sure everybody feels for me having to answer this question. There's a few ways to answer this. One analogy I would like to make, this is not my final answer, I just want to start with an analogy, is, similar to organic fruit. When organic fruit was like first kind of reached its, cultural popularity, it started like more in the 70s to be kind of, mass market. But when it really reached, full popularity, or I should say initially, it was extremely exorbitantly expensive, and you would go into a grocery store and you could only find a few things and it was hard to find. But as farmers realized that there was a consumer demand for organic produce, that they could convert their crops to organic farming, they could, garner a higher yield per pound for the crops that they produced, and that of course it's, healthier for the land and for the biodiversity of, the soil and things like that. More and more farmers switched over to organic, and now you can walk into a store and find, almost, depending on the grocery store, you can find similar options. And the cost of organic is still more expensive than conventional, no doubt, but it's not as exorbitantly as expensive as it used to be, because of course the demand, has increased. So I think one thing, that's really challenging is it is still, very niche. And, Pietro can probably speak to this more, to farm organic cotton, to grow organic cotton. The demand for it is just simply not as high. The average consumer is not demanding, fair wages. They're not demanding, organic crops. They're not demanding, less hazardous chemicals in the dyeing process. So the consumer does play a big role over time in driving that down. But one of the greatest challenges that we faced in, sustainable fashion is that it is very, very much elitist. It is very, very inaccessible right now. The brands that are, claiming to check all the boxes and do all the right things are selling dresses that cost $350 and, T-shirts that cost $75, $100. And it's hard if you think about, the kind of supply chain that I talked about, where all of those, up to 25, even more hands, and you look at Pietro's model of how it moved around the world, and you just think about even just the people involved in the transportation alone and not the actual making of the garments, how many hands it touched and how many people who need to make it. It's hard to drive that price down too much. But one thing I always challenge people to think about is, one of the things that I found out in researching Ross is that one of the people that make clothes for Ross, who are being paid, these very exploitative wages and often, not being paid their wages, shop at Ross. And you're like, oh my God, how could they do that, by this company that's exploiting them? But then you think about the fact that where else can they afford to shop? They can't afford to shop anywhere else. So one thing I challenge people to think about is going back into that process and saying, well, if, and this is, I'm not saying this isn't a utopia. I'm not saying this isn't a fantasy world, but if each worker in that supply chain was actually paid what they were justly owed, then the average worker would be able to afford, a better quality of living, would be able to afford, more things for their family. But the challenge with this race to the bottom is that, in the race to make things cheaper and cheaper, the brands aren't going to pay that cost. They're not going to let their margins suffer. They're not going to give up their profitability. So the only, person that's going to pay that price is the very last person in the supply chain. And so with the race to the bottom, the only one that's suffering is, those agricultural workers, those garment workers whose pay keeps getting lower and lower. And so I know it's not realistic, but the idea would be that if everyone was paid what they were justly owed, people could afford better resources. And if there was more collective demand for it, then the cost of those resources could also go down. So no, I don't have a perfect answer for that, but those are just some things to think about.
Oh, I think that was a great answer. Thank you so much, Rebecca. We're going to take questions for about 5 more minutes. This question I'm going to open up to whichever of the panelists would like to answer it, and if multiple would like to answer it. Okay. So do any of you have a sense of how many immigrant apparel workers there are in the US today versus 100 years ago, and in the rest of the world versus the US? It seems that this is an issue that comes up often.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick stab and say no, I don't. I couldn't possibly give you numbers. I can't say that the garment industry is associated in the United States, anyways, is associated with immigrant workers, but in one place they're not. Well, it depends on where in the South, but in the US South, that's not the case, right? In the US South, remember, factories, garment factories were, like most factories, a privilege of whiteness, right? A privilege of whiteness. And that was very different than you would see. Now, there's some exceptions to that. In New Orleans, there were African-American or factories that were dominated by African-American women sewing machine operators. But to compare from 100 years ago, it's almost like what you're really doing is comparing like California now to New York 100 years ago. And that would be a great book. But I have not written that book. So I'm going to say there's something there to chew on, but I don't have the answer.
The one thing I guess I could toss in is that today in the United States, 97.5% of the apparel that we buy is imported. So that means only 2.5% is actually has the sewing done in the United States. Now, as recently as 1990, half of our apparel that we purchased in the United States was stitched in the United States. So we have only a very, very small slice left in the US, and it's that slice is there for very particular reasons. So that's been, just the dramatic change. We're talking about an industry that has some pockets. It has some pockets in New York. It has some pockets in LA. But besides that, the places that it's growing are the places where it's automated. So we have sock factories now in Alabama that have no people, for example. So, and that gets back to the point I was making earlier.
Hey, Pietro, I'm going to interrupt here. Sorry, Addie, but I really have a question that I want to ask Pietro. Pietro, so to take that further, so you were saying at the end of your presentation that, because in my book, I make a big claim, like, the labor unions, the people who care about this, they have got to look beyond the United States. Instead of thinking of foreign workers as taking away American jobs, we got to raise the bottom, we got to raise the floor, right? And that means that the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, as it used to be known, now is Unite Here. But I mean, that means they should be really international, and they really weren't. International for them meant Canada, right? And that was their big expansion. So what should we do as or is it not I guess I'm just stuck. Like, what do we do now that it seems like there's current exploitation, but also automation on the horizon? And this is a particularly difficult moment, I think, in the history of the garment industry.
Well, again, it is not a unique industrial development. It has happened in every industry, and it is now happening in this one. I think the only thing that's different is that, it's very late, right, compared to other industries. And the reason it's late is because the technology of getting robots to handle soft goods was very tricky to develop. So, if you think about a robot, snapping a car tire on, that's easier technologically than getting a robot to actually handle fabric. So it took a long time. It was actually, technology was originally developed at Georgia Tech, but now it's here. And again, I think it is explosive. And, I think that people concerned about the global labor force, really our work is back to first principles, okay? And by that, what I mean is that, women, particularly girls, in many of these countries, need to be given the access to education to be able to fulfill the kinds of roles in the economy that are going to be available to them. So, those sewing machine jobs in Bangladesh, I am concerned are going to vanish and going to vanish very quickly. Okay. Now, if the women in those sewing machines have skills, if they have technology skills, for example, if they have basic literacy and so forth, then they will be able to adapt, just like, when we had technology take over in cotton production. So I think, focusing on those fundamental human rights particularly education and valuing girls, is the best focus for our work.
Thank you. I'm gonna end with one last quick question. And this may be better suited for Rebecca, because I'm kind of rephrasing the question. So we've got some interest in understanding or learning about, is this exploitation happening at all different price points, or is it just at lower price points?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's at every price point. I mean, I think, one thing that really needs to be discussed in the fashion industry is the question of margins. A lot of these sustainable fashion brands will say that they'll pay the workers $15 an hour, or they'll pay, for certain things to be done, but then, they'll still want to mark up the garment and take this exorbitant margin for the sake of profitability. And so it's not being paid back to the garment workers. I currently, in my role as director of development at Sway Sew Shop, which I encourage everyone to check out on Instagram so you can see our activist work. That is the handle, Sway Sew Shop. We get people approaching us all the time, and even people who have really great reputations like Patagonia and some of those other ones. When we say, well, this is what we want to pay our workers for this skilled work, if you're going to work with us, they're not willing to go there. And so, unfortunately, I say what I want people to understand is that just because something is expensive doesn't mean it was sustainably or ethically made. Just because somebody says they're a sustainable brand doesn't mean that they're doing right by the workers and their supply chains. You have to dig deeper. You have to ask so many more questions, because in an era of rampant greenwashing, we as consumers want to feel good about what we're purchasing. And for even those of us who are on the inside of the industry who know what's going on, I still have to dig deep when I'm wanting to, engage with another brand and see what they're doing. I still have to dig very deep to really see what's going on there. So you really can't just take a brand who's telling you they're sustainable or telling you they're ethical at face value. And you can't just assume that because something is expensive that it's necessarily sustainable. You really have to do your research.
Fantastic. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add to that? Well, we kind of reached our allotted time. Before we leave, I would love for our panelists to share maybe how our viewers can keep up with them, whether it's on social media or websites or any type of web-based important sources they would like our viewers to follow up on.
So I'll start by saying that I'm on social media. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Instagram. I'm rarely on Instagram, but I'm always happy to take people's questions about the history of the garment industry in the United States South on Facebook and Twitter.
Unfortunately, I'm old school. I don't have a social media presence, but you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my Georgetown University webpage, and I'd be happy to correspond with people who have questions.
I would love for people to reach out on Instagram. It's actually how I share a lot of my activism and how we rally a lot of our activists, through our Remake Network and the Garment Workers Center, and share a lot of information. My personal Instagram handle is just R Blake Thompson. So Rebecca Blake Thompson, but just R Blake Thompson. And then I encourage everyone to follow Sway Sew Shop. So that's SUAY Sew Shop, so that you can see about the work that we're doing there as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michelle, Pietro, and Rebecca, for joining us tonight. This was a great evening.
It really was. Thank you, guys. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Such an honor to be with you guys. Thank you.
And thanks everybody for joining us. They're fantastic.